Hi, welcome to WAVE, Channel 20, Auburn Community Television, and this episode of Meet the Artist. Meet the Artist is supported by the North Auburn Artist to introduce artists in our local community. Hi, I'm Lucinda Laughlin. I am your host, and today our guest local artist is Paul Harman. I am absolutely thrilled to have Paul here with us today because he is a fellow pastel artist, and I am always looking forward to learning new ideas about how to work with pastels and also to share the visions that we have in pastels. Paul, thank you so very much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Lucinda. It's great to be here.
Now let's start out and talk a little bit about your background, because I think your background is pretty significant to the way that you see and are able to pick up the details that you have in your pastel work. So you were born in England.
I was.
And tell me a little bit about the area that you were born in.
I was born on the coast of Bournemouth and in 1943 during the war. And we lived in this big house right on the cliff overlooking the English Channel. And right next door to us, just beyond our garden, was Shelley's cottage.
Now, if you were living then on the, so is this in the Dorset area?
The south coast of England, in Bournemouth.
Which is an absolutely gorgeous area.
It is.
And so growing up with that, and you left though when you were 7.
I did.
But you had 7 years of this incredible landscape that you were living in.
Yes.
And that's part of what I think I see in your paintings, even though you're not painting that area.
No, but we also lived in Canada for 8 years. And saw some amazing scenery in Banff and other places in Canada, because I lived in the East Coast and the West Coast of Canada.
And so how old were you then when you moved to the United States?
15.
And where did you move to?
We moved to the big city of Los Angeles.
Also a place that I have lived to as well. I'm not so sure that gets us into the landscaping, but it is definitely a different environment.
Very definitely.
And so now you were a police officer.
I was a deputy sheriff with the LA County Sheriff for 25 years and retired as a lieutenant.
And then you retired up here in Auburn.
We moved the family up here, and I took a job with the state of California for 14 years. But my wife said, "Oh dear, I don't want to live in Sacramento." And I said, "Well, we can live in the foothills." And she said, "Okay."
And Auburn is such a perfect selection.
It is. It's a beautiful town. We love it.
When I was thinking about moving up here, and I actually asked around people that I saw, because I was coming up here to work a lot, and I said, if you were retiring up here, where would you move? And they all told me Auburn.
Yes.
Well, I am so glad that you've joined us. Now, one of the things I found interesting was because of your police background, being in the sheriff's department, is that I notice in your pastel work is that there is a very definite attention to detail that you get in it. And I think that is somewhat of the discipline that you had in that career.
It could be, but when I was young, I was doing very detailed drawings in pencil and in charcoal and pen and ink. I was a detail freak, a real realist, because I wanted to recreate what I was actually seeing. And I'm still that way.
And you know, I think that I was much the same. And in fact, one of my favorite artists was always Norman Rockwell. Now, while he wasn't exact, there was some caricature type of work that he was doing, but he was still so very detailed.
Very much.
And I found myself always trying to make that photograph. And you actually have been able to do that. I finally gave up and decided I'm not, you know, the photograph is the photograph. Yes. But you have definitely captured that photo image, but you also do work in plein air as well.
I do.
And let's explain what plein air is, because some people may not know.
Well, plein air, I guess the simple words would be to say it's fresh air painting out in the outdoors. On scene, for example, if you were at the beach or up in the mountains and wanted to capture a particular scene. And it is really good for artists to do that because you get a much better realization of the colors and the details, and you see so much more the way the sunlight hits, because if you take a picture, it shows shadows and a lot of other things, very dark. But when you see it with your eyes, it has a lot more vibrancy.
Now, if you're going to be working out in plein air, do you also take a photograph of what you are working on? Because you'd have to be working very fast.
You do. You do have to work faster.
Okay.
But usually when I start, I will take a picture of what it is I'm going to paint so that I lock in the lighting at the time, because the lighting is changing constantly.
And that affects the painting how? In the fact that the lighting is changing?
Well, you have to establish where your shadows are going to be early on in the game, because as the sun rises, if you're starting early in the morning, it's changing the whole color palette that you're working with. And those very bright colors that you had start to wash out as the sun rises.
And I remember one of my early art teachers telling me is that you've got to set where your sun is coming from. It can't be moving about in your picture.
That's right.
So that's why I've always worked from photographs, because to me it's like, okay, I'm going to set that so I know where it is. And also I think that doing pastel work would be particularly difficult out in nature.
It can be, but because pastel is both a painting medium and a drawing medium, then if you have good drawing skills, then you can quickly get the set of the painting. You may finish it when you get back to the studio, as I have done often, is to add some final details, but I really lock in the colors and what it is I'm painting while I'm on the scene.
I like that where you described it as a painting medium as well as a drawing medium.
Yeah.
I've never thought of it in that way, but you're right.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the pastels.
Okay.
And you have brought some pastels today.
I have.
And I have to say I am actually impressed that all of your colors are so perfect together.
Well, I arrange my colors by value, and that way when I'm reaching for colors, then the dark ones are here, the lighter ones are on top, and it's much quicker to reach them. And I also put them by color, and so they're sorted by color and value.
Now, so what is a pastel?
A pastel is actually a stick of pigment, pure pigment, the same pigment that we use in watercolor, oils, or acrylics. But with the stick of pastel, like for example like this pastel, it is held together with a binder, and that binder just keeps the pastel in one piece.
It's just enough to keep it in that piece.
Yes.
Now, there are all kinds of different pastels, and you actually shared some pastels with me and they actually seem softer. So there's a softness to hardness range.
There are.
And so I had somebody talking to me about she works in hard pastels versus soft pastels. Have you heard of that distinction?
Well, yes, because I start with hard pastels.
Okay.
And the hard pastels would be either Giraud pastels, which are square. They have more of the gum arabic in them that makes it a much harder pastel stick. And they look more like a stick of chalk, which of course they're not, but that's what they look like. And the Prismacolor pastels are also a harder pastel. But I usually start roughing in the undercolors with the harder pastels, and then move into the more medium and do the soft pastels at the very end.
And I also noticed that some of the soft ones that you gave me almost have a creamy feel to them.
They do, what they call a buttery feel.
Yes, they do.
Yes.
And that was kind of surprising. I actually have found, I've realized now that I work mostly with hard pastels, and it's mainly because of the way that I use them. So let's explain a little bit of difference in the techniques. Because what I do is I grind it down to get the powder and then lift it with my finger with the tissue on it and put it to the paper. But you don't do it that way.
No, I don't.
Okay, so let's tell the way you do it.
Well, when I start with my paintings, I start with an undercoat, and I'll do a rough in the color background, sometimes the opposite color that I'm going to have when I finish, and then I will liquefy that with terpenoid or with alcohol, and it looks just like a watercolor painting as a base. And then I will start overlaying that with pastels, and I start with the medium pastels, and I end up with the high points, or the most light will end up with the very softest pastels, because you can just touch those in there and add that color.
Now you have brought us a sequence of photographs that you have actually of this particular piece behind us.
I have.
So let's take that, and I think it shows in photography a little better of what you're talking about here.
Okay. Now, when I start with if I have a photographic reference, I grid it off so that if I'm going to transfer this photograph to my pastel board, then I can get it accurate. And then I will do a rough in of pastel. This is very, very rough. And then I liquefy it, as you see here. And this looks more like a watercolor painting when it's done. And then I went over it with a white pastel pencil to bring the highlights up. And then I start adding in the color on top of that. I usually start at the top, you can see with the clouds, and I work down. And then when you get down to the finish, then you come
we have
over
on this
here,
side.
and I'm putting in final details, and then this is the finished painting here, which is
Actually behind us. Well, now when you're in this particular stage, now so you're using the actual bringing the pastel to the paper.
Yes.
And are you using the point, the edge, the side of it? How are you?
Well, it depends on what area I am working on, but I use the points for finer details, but I use the sides just like you would a brush to put color in a larger area. Because you can do that with pastels. And you'll notice if you look at my group of pastels, none of them have any paper on them because they all come wrapped in paper. And I take all the paper off of them.
So you can use them on the sides.
I can use the sides.
And now someone else also told me about pastel pencils. Do you ever use pastel pencils?
I do. I have a set of Prismacolor pastel pencils. They look just like this pencil. Some people would say, "Oh, I've got pencils like that," but they're probably not pastel pencils. But they come in a full range of colors. They're put together with a harder binder than the regular pastels, but you can match the colors.
And I found what's really nice about those that you can really get in with your very fine detail with them. Because when I first started out, like I said, I do everything with my finger, and trying to get those fine little lines and everything, that was a little bit difficult.
It is. I use those pastel pencils when I do something as small as this. This is actually just one of my art cards, but when I do the eyes on the bird or the legs or the little tiny little branches that are holding up these little berries, then I'll use those pastel pencils, and they work very well.
Now, do you do anything with them once you've put the pastel on to do blending, to actually be touching with a finger or something like that?
I blend in several different ways. I will use a stump, an artist stump. Sometimes I'll use my finger, and other times I'll use like those little packing pieces. Like this is actually one of those little packing things. It's covered in pastel, but they're wonderful for blending pastel.
Oh, I see. It's like a felt, almost a felt type of or styrofoam.
It's styrofoam.
That's what this is.
But
covered in pastel. That's the full. Oh, okay. Never thought about that as something to help blend it.
And you don't get any oil from that into your painting.
You know, I am so fortunate to be doing this program because I learn so much every time I interview someone. So thank you for that little tidbit.
Oh, you're welcome.
So let's talk a little bit about the artwork that you have brought and some of the technique that you used. We've already shown the sequence for the one behind us.
Okay.
And I love the way that the light is in this and the shadows. And particularly the purple and those colors. So, you know, one of the things that always amazes me is the colors that we use to depict things like shadow.
Yes.
And in this one I noticed the purples, and it looks like almost the rose colors that you've used for that.
Yes, I use, in shadow areas I'll use blues or purples. And in the Grand Canyon you get some of both.
Yes.
And the trees actually that are on the other side of the Grand Canyon will show up almost as blue. And then all of the mountain or areas will show up purple from a distance.
And I think that that's always the thing too, is just how many colors we use in all of the paintings that we do.
Yes.
Because I am using them in the way I do is when I'm finished and I have all of these pastels out, I'm not as neat and organized as yours are. And so I'll have this palette and I'll have every one that I've used. And so I started to take pictures of it just because I think you need to see the number of colors that go into this.
Right. I have a little tray that's next to my easel, and when I take a pastel that I'm using on that painting, I will set that pastel in the tray so that if I come back to that area, I can reach for that same color and not have to go back to the palette and say, oh, what color was that?
What color was it? I call that for myself, I call it setting the colors.
Yes.
Because then they're there, I know which ones I'm using, and so it stays consistent through the painting.
Does.
Now the one that's just over your left shoulder, I have to make sure I get right and left right. This is a beautiful picture, pastel with all of the rocks and the water that you have coming through, and there's just the trees, it's just absolutely beautiful. So tell me about this technique of the stonework and your waterwork.
Well, this is a painting I call Fall's Majesty, and I love to do water and I love to do rocks, and I do a lot of shading with different colors to establish the volume of the rock, so to speak. This one has more rocks than I usually do. I'm sure some people would simplify it more than I did.
Yeah, I think I would get really tired of stones. Did you find yourself moving from one stone to the other and go, I'm tired with that one, I'm going to go over here?
I actually eliminated quite a few stones because I figured I'm a stone's throw away from finishing. I can just eliminate.
Hey, that rock isn't as necessary as I thought it was.
Yes.
I just did one with people, and it was the same way as I was getting. It was like, oh, I really don't need that person.
Right.
They're gone.
Yes.
So now the water, and I am always intrigued about how you do the water, and you just capture how it flows. So if you can, tell me how you go about that process.
I use a lot of different colors in the water. I don't just use one color. A lot of people will use a lot of white to show the white water, but if you look at the river, they've got blues from reflecting from the sky, they've got dark greens, there's sometimes browns from the bottom of the river, and so I will use a lot of different colors and try and make it look like there is movement within that color.
Now do you bring looks like some white, for lack of highlights within it. Is that one of the last steps that you take in it?
Yes. I add the white at the very end.
You know, I don't find that I use white very often, and because I don't do a lot of water, I tend to try to stay away from it.
Yes.
But I can see with the white, and I think you probably have put some of it into the rocks as well.
I did.
Yes.
When I do an ocean scene, then there is a lot of white in surf.
I think you have brought a print here. Yes. Showing.
This one, which I call The Soothing Sounds of the Sea, has got a lot of action with the surf and the waves, and it was particularly difficult to capture the actual movement of the waves.
It absolutely would.
And I used an undercoat to indicate the sand underneath. That's where the undercoat really came in handy. And of course with the rocks and the seagulls and the clouds, it just brings it all together.
I love the way you've done here, so when the water is actually going back and you still always have that light glistening of it, and how you've been able to capture that. And now with the seagulls, now this is talking about when you're using the pastel pencils to do that detail on them.
Right.
Well, this is really pretty.
This is a much larger painting. This is actually a print of a much larger painting.
And that's what I tend to have giclée prints made.
Yes.
And I guess I actually did some looking up as what giclée means. Have you ever looked up that word?
I haven't.
Oh, well, it's really kind of interesting. So I'm going to share that with you. Basically, there was this guy who came up with the high definition prints of paintings, and because his clientele were artists. And so, but he thought, oh, high definition prints, that doesn't go anywhere. So he started looking around, and he knows people like French words. Look at plein air, you know, they throw these out. And so he started looking through various French words, and he came up with the word je, then, and then he just put clay, je clay, with it, and that's how he came up with this word. Where it came from, the word actually means spitting on paper, is how it comes off defined. And so that's where je clay comes from. So I just thought that was an interesting tidbit, and it actually was in the 90s when this technique was developed.
And when you say the word, it's almost like spitting on paper.
Je clay. So let's talk about the one that I have over here,
Okay.
which again is absolutely incredible stonework that you've done, and the water coming over it. And I'm so caught up with the water. But I also love the cabin or the house that's off.
Yes.
And in both of the pictures, which I forgot to talk about over here, were the trees. And you do fabulous trees.
Oh, thank you. I have fun with the trees, but I think they're a key to establishing the realism in the painting. The surroundings of what your focal point is, if they are believable, then the focal point comes together with it. And this scene is, I call it High Sierra Retreat, is actually an existing cabin that sits right on the edge of the Yuba River, just above Rainbow Lodge on Old Highway 40. And it has flooded a couple of times this past winter, last winter when I had the tremendous
because of the
amounts of
water
rain.
that's come through here.
Yes.
Now, when you did the trees, did you do the same process where you started with the undercolor was the darker green,
I did.
and then you came in over with that finer detail?
Yes, I did.
And the finer detail that you have in the branch work, is that done with the pastel pencils, or do you did the
some
edge?
of it I used the edges of the harder
Okay.
pastels, and some of it is done with pastel pencils for the finer branches.
Now, I understand that you studied with a very well-known Auburn artist for almost a year, and that was Rafe Erickson.
It is.
And I certainly see his influence on you, but I think you have gone a step beyond.
Well, Rafe became a very good friend, but I always consider Rafe my mentor. He was an exceptional artist, and he was an exceptional teacher because he had such a wonderful demeanor. When he would critique your paintings, he would never bruise your feelings. He would say, well, if I was doing it, I would add a little more of this, or I'd add a little more of that. And I thoroughly enjoyed him. He taught me so much about color and value and technique in pastel.
Now, when you would go and work with him, would you do just a lot of side-by-side painting? Is that how you would go about?
Well, Rafe would go through with a class of about 3 students, 3 or 4 students, and he would do a painting in about 30 minutes or less, and a finished 9x12 painting, and you'd stare and watch him, and you'd think, my goodness, how can I do something like that? And then he'd finish it up, and he'd say, all right, now it's your turn. And we would have to do the same painting that he had done. He'd give each of us a picture, a 5x7 picture, and then we would start working on it. And he would go around the room and look at how people were doing, how they were coming. And he would make comments, and sometimes if somebody needed something to be demonstrated, he'd demonstrate how to do it. But he was a wonderful teacher.
And I can imagine that was a lot of value in learning how to, one is use the pastels, but just the techniques that actually make it easier working with the pastels.
Yes. I've heard a number of people that have come through a studio on the tour said, well, I tried pastels, but I got so frustrated, I just got covered in pastel dust and I couldn't ever make anything except mud.
And I had somebody say, oh, that's really hard and unforgiving. I've heard that comment. And I'm like, I think it's one of the more forgiving to work with.
Because if you don't like what you have there, you can brush it off and start over.
Exactly. Joyce Williams was a guest, and she had told me about these little air things that you clean your keyboards off for your computers.
Yes.
And boy, are those great, because you can spray it on them, that just gets rid of the pastel. It doesn't get it cleared down so the paper is just pristine,
No,
but it at least gets enough out of the way.
it does. There's a danger in doing it that way, though.
Okay.
You do not want to push that pastel dust into the air. And
yes.
if you use that kind of thing, it'll push it in the air. The same thing as if you blow on it,
I know.
then you're going to be breathing that pastel dust. And some of these pastels have harmful elements in them because they're pure pigment.
I know. She told me that too.
So what I do is I have a brush in here that is a stiff little bristle brush, and I will just take that and brush off that area that I'm not happy with. And
Oh,
then
no, that's an idea. I've never
Start
thought about, see, another thing. Now I'll try that technique. Now, one of the things that you actually have some classes now, you have now gone from being the student, that you're now a teacher.
I am.
And so tell me a little bit about the classes that you're giving.
Well, I'm giving a workshop at the Sacramento Fine Arts Center that's on Gibbons Drive down in Carmichael. And it will be on January the 19th. It'll be a half-day workshop from 1 o'clock until 5.
And if somebody wants to sign up for your workshop, how do they go about doing that?
They can contact the Sacramento Fine Arts Center, and they can probably go online to the Sacramento Fine Arts and download the form for the workshop, and just email it in with a check for the workshop.
Now, in addition to your workshop, are you going to be in any shows that are coming up, or are you showing any place right now?
I have a show that will be coming up at the Auburn Faith Hospital in the springtime. I think it's end of January that I'll be putting it up.
Well, you know, unfortunately, we have run out of time. So what I would like is for you to give the information to our audience if they want to come and see your studio or if they want to get in contact with you.
Okay. Well, I appreciate it. If you want to call me, my phone number is 530-889-0549, and I'll give you directions to my studio, which is at my home. I have a website, www.paulmharman.com. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram.
Well, Paul, I thank you again so much for coming by. I always enjoy looking at your work and sharing some of the details about how you go about doing it. I have to say I'm going to steal some of your ideas.
Well, thank you, Lucinda. I thoroughly enjoyed this.
All right, thank you. I also want to thank you for viewing Meet the Artist and signing into Auburn Community Television on Wave Channel 20. I have certainly appreciated the journey in meeting various artists in the community, and I hope that you have too. And maybe you have found an artist living just around the corner.